Hi, my name is Faraz Rizvi, and welcome to the Clear the Air podcast, brought to you by the Center for Community Action and Environmental Justice. We're here discussing political and relevant social issues here in the Inland Empire to dig deep against misinformation here in the IE. We're going to be talking about political issues that are relevant to the Inland Empire and how they affect everybody here in our community. So we wanted to take a time to discuss voting, especially the 2020 election, and everything that's really on the propositions. The propositions can be really confusing, and honestly, I myself barely understand them. So we wanted to make sure that everybody in our community had the ability to get informed and educated about what they mean and, what they stand for. This election is probably going to be the most important election of our lifetimes. It's very important that we exercise our voice and that we make sure that our community is heard loud and clear for the things that we stand for and the things that we stand against. So with that, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into the propositions. Joining us today will be Italia, who is the political director for our organization, the CCAJ. We're going to be talking about, in depth, all of the propositions. Thank you, Italia. Thank you for joining us today. How are you?
Yeah, hey Faraz, good to be here, and thanks for everyone who's listening and tuning in into our section today on the propositions. It's good to be here. It's good to talk about important information that's coming up, and especially with just a few days around the corner.
Yeah, so, the elections are really close. They're about 2 weeks away. Ballots have already dropped. And a lot of people don't know, but that they'll be receiving mail-in ballots. What work has have we been doing right now to educate voters?
Yeah, thank you for that. I think this year is going to be a very monumental year, right? Not only because it's a presidential year, but under pandemic COVID-19 conditions, voting looks entirely different, and even our operations look entirely different than any other election year would look. And so for us, we've been really engaging voters in a virtual way, in a contactless manner. We are going to be actually going out to the doors in a couple of days and dropping off voter guides and voter information. Pretty much how to vote, right? Voters have the traditional way of going out and dropping their ballots at the poll location, but we're really encouraging them to just fill it out, complete it, and mail it out without having to leave their home or risk any contact with other individuals if that is something that they don't feel comfortable with. And so we are also going to be holding a couple of virtual webinars, and my colleague Adonis, you might see him on in our Instagram, and making sure that he's answering questions that sometimes voters, especially first time voters, might have. And so yeah, so those are some of the things that we have been doing, and just trying to also encourage people, to make sure that they return their ballot and that they complete it in the best way possible so that they don't have any issues with their ballot.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. That's great. And a lot of people will be seeing how different this election cycle has been, especially with digital outreach as like the norm. A lot of people are used to getting canvassers to their doors and mailers, and this time around it's a lot of digital organizing. And so this does complicate a lot of ways in which people receive information. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is make sure that we're also adjusting, our outreach to the community and making sure that people have the knowledge and the information they need to discuss the props. We can get started and talk about some of the impending props and what they stand for, and just demystify them a little bit so that people understand what we're talking about.
Yeah, definitely. I think this time around, we have a total of the 13 propositions that are going to be in the ballot, right? And a lot of the times propositions are worded so in such a tricky way that it makes voters confused, and you don't know if you're voting yes means that yes it's supporting, or the no means no. And so we always try to at least clarify for voters what is it that the proposition is intending to do, and have them make that decision on their own whether they want to support it or not. And so we know that Proposition 16, right, restoring affirmative action in California, it is actually would also be a constitutional amendment, right? And really, what it's going to intend to do, this practice has been illegal since 1996. And so it's going to retract that and make sure that, there are affirmative action classes that folks can now utilize when seeking employment. One of those being, ethnicity, race, color, and origin, place of origin. And for example, right, Prop 16, back when California did not allow affirmative action, the state offices in California could not take any of those items that I mentioned that are protected classes in many ways into consideration when hiring. And so this really helps to bring diversity into hiring practices, especially as the state continues to, be more diverse.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you look at the background of this proposition because the law that got rid of affirmative action, which is the law that would be repealed, it was actually a law that banned any sort of uh, preferential or discriminatory treatment. So for a lot of people who may be looking at the ballot, it could be confusing as to, does this help communities of color or does this, go in another direction by, making it more difficult for them. And so would you be able to explain a little bit more as to what does a yes vote mean on this and what does a no vote mean? Because when I was looking at it, I myself was confused. And so this could help a lot of people who may be supporting it one way or disagreeing with it one way, but who accidentally vote the opposite way.
Right. I think the intent also from my understanding, right, of the proposition and also the history of like you mentioned in California in terms of both also not just hiring practices but also like admissions into colleges or universities. That has been one of the biggest I guess ways that folks see affirmative action, right? When admissions are able to take into consideration or not, right, are able to take or not into consideration things such as race, ethnicity, place of origin. And so one of the things I think that it's worth noting, right, is that uh, in essence, right, it is gonna allow for other factors to be taken into consideration, but it doesn't mean that, just because you are, a person of color, for example, or come from a foreign country, for example, or are from a foreign country, or are of a specific race or even ethnicity, that you're going to have a preferential treatment. And I think that's where a lot of times that division comes or that confusion comes, is just going to mean that you're going to be able to explicitly say that, and that can be taken into consideration when company or when folks are trying to either through admissions or through hiring practices. And so a lot of the times it could be where folks might think, well, now, it's going to mean that if you have two people that are equally qualified, that, it's going to discriminate against other folks that are not in affirmative action per se. But I wouldn't, in my perspective, based on how the proposition reads, that wouldn't be the case.
Right. It would just kind of repeal this existing framework that was intended to kind of dismantle affirmative action here in California.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Sure.
Perfect. Yeah. No. Thank you for that. And then so we talked about Prop 16, and I know another proposition we wanted to discuss was Prop 17. Can you go on a little bit about that?
Yeah, with Prop 17, really, it's Prop 17. I see it as a combination of multiple both propositions or legislative actions that have occurred in the past decade to have a more inclusive voting population. Right. We're gonna touch on another proposition that also touches on that inclusivity, and this is really for to allow people that are on parole in California to vote, right? So I think when we think about voting, sometimes we think, well, you have to be a U.S. citizen, you have to meet age requirements, but a lot of times we don't think about that. There's a population that gets pretty much their right to vote stripped away because of whatever life circumstances. And so this proposition intends to repeal that and ensure that there is a more inclusive democracy, and that just because you have you are on parole, right? That you don't you're not excluded from voting, because that is ultimately your right as a U.S. citizen, and also as an active participant in our democracy.
Right. And I think this is important, and that's a context that a lot of people miss out on, especially given, we're entering a phase in American society that's after mass incarceration, and the war on drugs and the impact that these policies have had on communities of color, especially, restricting someone's right to vote for, any kind of felony can, really hobble communities in terms of getting the support that they need and having their voices heard.
Yeah, and another part to it is, I think, in the larger scope of voting, right? It's a form of being civically active, civically engaged, and interested in participating, right? And I think that also could be a tool of empowerment to somebody, right? That you don't feel that everything in your life has been stripped away, but it could also be a way to encourage someone to be part of the process civically, and also just partake in decisions that affect us on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, no, definitely. And, a lot of communities who don't have that access to being able to vote and exercise their electoral power often feel alienated from larger political and civic institutions. And so this can be a way to redress that.
Right.
So one of the propositions we were looking at was Prop 17, which is a very controversial proposition and does have a lot of immense impact in not just California, but our Inland Empire community as well. Would you be able to explain a little bit for the community what Prop 17 is?
Yeah, with Prop 17, as we were discussing, is really goes into allowing folks that have committed felonies and are on parole to have the opportunity to vote, right? And so it can be controversial, because many people feel that the right to vote is not only a benefit as a citizen, but as a good, quote unquote, good moral citizen. And so they might think, right, civic duty, right? So they might think that stripping that away is sort of seen as a punishment for not, aligning yourself in good moral character. However, there are others who think otherwise, right? Others might say, well, it is suppressing one's right to vote, as a U.S. citizen with age requirements, and that's going to be something that voters will decide whether it's something that they want to provide that opportunity for folks that have been in have committed a felony or are on parole, or to give them a second chance and be active members in a civic way.
Right. And currently, California law does allow individuals who are on probation to vote. But if you are on parole, you are not allowed to vote. What this means is that you're not in prison, but you are out of prison on parole. You're not allowed to vote. So this proposition would extend that right to those as well, and kind of, once you're out of prison, you're allowed to vote. And you're right. A lot of people do feel a lot of different ways about it, especially about whether this is voter suppression in terms of taking away people's right to vote for a lifetime, or whether you forfeit these rights when you go to prison. So there's a lot of robust conversation here, and this is definitely a proposition where we encourage people to look into it and look into the effect that this kind of legislation has on communities, especially communities of color, who are most impacted by mass incarceration, especially in the United States and here in California, especially where we have a very high population of incarcerated peoples.
Yeah.
So thank you for going over Prop 17 and all of the issues that are associated. We hope that people will be able to make their decisions about which is the right way to go, especially as it regards to the Inland Empire.
Most definitely. Yeah, we really do want to encourage folks, right, on all the propositions. We are, as voters, when I say we, as Californians and as voters, we are to a certain extent deciding a lot of life changing opportunities or life-changing events in the upcoming years for our future generations.
So another proposition that a lot of people are discussing and that has a lot of ramifications, especially during this current economic crisis related to COVID, is Proposition 21, which deals with rent control. Would you like to explain a little bit about the different facets of Proposition 21 and how it affects voters everywhere?
Yeah, you know what's interesting about this proposition is that prior to 1995, cities had the opportunity to control rent, right, and have their own local rent control formulas and implementations of that. But that did change after 1995. So since then, for the past 25 years, we haven't local municipalities haven't had that opportunity. And so, as we're seeing under the COVID-19 pandemic, that a lot of decisions, especially at the beginning, right? A lot of decisions on both whether it was any type of rent amendments or forgiveness or freezes, it came from the local municipalities, and then it sort of trickled up to the state, and then the state made sort of a decision, right? But that kind of goes, it kind of helps us understand that local municipalities can have and many times do have a lot of power, and directly as it deals with folks that live on fixed incomes, right, or that live on, in this case, that relied on an industry that sort of went down, like the restaurant industry and the retail industries, that now folks are living under very, very tight budgets, right, in their households. And so for this proposition, right, we know that it can allow, or will allow that local municipalities to have those rent controls, and but it has to be as long as the rental housing is at least 15 years or older, so it's not a new property. Even though right now we're under an economic crisis, and to many that might make sense, it doesn't mean that to everyone that makes sense. Long term, there could be, there's people that believe that it's not going to be profitable for developers, right? And so that is something that voters will have to decide on, whether they would want to allow their local municipalities to have that. It doesn't automatically mean that they will even enact it, but it will give them the opportunity to, if chosen.
And so this would be a repeal of the Costa-Hawkins legislation that banned any type of rent control in any city.
Right.
And give the communities power to decide autonomously whether they want to or not.
Right. Yeah, and voters will also be able to influence their local city council and mayor, and city representatives on what that means, because we cannot say the same thing for Riverside and the same thing for San Bernardino cities, that they have the same needs even in terms of housing. So
right, and there are definitely regional issues that affect housing. For example, one that our organization has been uplifting is a rent increase in the Inland Empire. There's actually been we have seen the highest increase in rents just because of the boom in online shopping, which has caused a shortage of warehouse space, actually, which has caused everyone's rents to rise. So this does have an impact here in the community. However, there are also members of the community and really in general all over who feel that a blanket standard for rent control would allow different areas to have the same opportunities for people to develop or whatnot. And really, it is up to the voters to decide which they think is impacting them, and how they feel.
yeah, and I think that you touched on something, right, with voters deciding, and I think another part to this proposition that makes it in many ways, I don't, maybe controversial or not, right, but in many ways the fact that if you have, there's a concept, right, if you have lower rents, or if you sort of have this control over the rent, that there's going to be less revenue, right? And so those are some of the things that some people might believe that to be the case, and so yeah.
Right, right. although there is currently a very clear housing crisis as well within
Yeah.
California, especially. So this legislation could have some serious ramifications.
Yeah, yeah, it will definitely, especially once the economy returns back into its feet, we don't, I think in general, we wouldn't want, I think this goes particularly for renters and renters of color, right? That you don't want to have a hike, immediately, or a hike that's sort of out of the market value too. And we have seen that happens all the time, especially with new development and also in certain developed areas, right? And so I think the voters will have the opportunity to look into that and see if it's appropriate to the times that we're in.
Perfect. Yeah, that's great. And the next proposition we wanted to discuss was Proposition 22, actually, which is a very controversial one, and does deal with current existing legislative kind of controversy with the gig economy, especially here in California, which has kind of pioneered the gig economy. A lot of people say that California is really America. Sped up, and so this issue affecting us will have a larger effect later. So, would you like to go into the what the proposition is and some of the controversy around it, especially maybe digging into AB 105, which created the stipulation that it would repeal?
Yeah, so for Prop 22, right, and the gig economy, and this is particularly for Uber and Lyft, right? So actually, I was a Lyft driver myself, right, and so I can kind of also speak to, yeah, I can kind of also speak from that personal experience, and having, especially in the Inland Empire, right, where you really don't have, aside from warehouses and that industry, a lot of the times, especially folks of color rely on these opportunities for work and employment. And however, it's changing their status, right? So what it would do, right, is pretty much repeal the legislation that made it sort of illegal for them to be hired as contractors, right, and to actually be employed as employed with benefits and under California law have that employment status. And it is definitely controversial because many folks who are drivers themselves may at times say, well, I it is my side gig, right, so I'd rather be employed as a contractor than have to be employed with benefits and employment. And but then at the same time, because of the economic and the needs for jobs, many people do this on a full-time basis and are working 70 to 80 hours as drivers, whether for Uber or Lyft, and without any benefits, without any labor law protections. And it really puts them in a very difficult situation, I think. And so voters are going to have the opportunity to say whether they want to continue on to a yes vote would mean that they would repeal the legislation, the state legislation, and then a no vote would mean that they would pretty much continue with the state legislation to not have those specific workers and the drivers as contractors. And so some of the we know obviously some of the folks that are supporting the folks that are putting the money behind it is Uber and Lyft, right, and Instacart and DoorDash. And then we also know that some of the folks that are against it are one of the largest labor unions, SEIU, and also the California Teachers Union. And so that kind of allows voters to give them a perspective on how is it that they want to vote, and how is it that they feel this gig economy should proceed. And perhaps it just could give folks a different perspective on the gig economy that may not be as contractors, but it could be an opportunity to explore other options that have long-term benefits. But that's something that voters will have to be looking into.
Right, and this is really controversial because it would really impact the way the gig economy works and how it changes really just the entire economy of the United States, or especially of California.
Right.
And with a lot of the attendant problems of benefits and health insurance, where most people are guaranteed health insurance by their full-time workers, these drivers who are working 70, 80 hours don't have that same benefit.
Yeah.
But there is a lot of, a lot to say for a lot of people behind the flexibility that the contract work gives them. So there is a lot of controversy about it. It's very clear that the industries that have pioneered the gig economy, Uber, Lyft, seem to benefit the most from the repeal of AB 105, which would reclassify these workers. So, with a lot of the issues, especially in California, about employment, about the economy, about the growth in the economy, this does have some serious ramifications here for the IE.
Yeah, and it really does. I mean, we are not too far from, LAX, major airports, Ontario, and a lot of, the workers rely on that method of income. However, it could be where, I mean, I'm excited to see post-election, right? What is that going to look like? Because it could be that it doesn't have to be an all or nothing, right? And we know that in general, everyone appreciates and wants and really should be a universal thing that we folks have, for example, healthcare, and those are things that and the benefits, right? Paid time off, all of that. We at times it could be where there's flexibility with this, and so we'll see, I guess, if both these gig economies, and particularly in this case for Uber and Lyft, if they are sort of willing to work with their workers, and if voters want to switch, and make that continue to be in that type of employment status.
Yeah, no, thank you for that context. It's a really important issue, and we'll see how the cards fall this election.
Yeah.
And so, one of the final props we wanted to discuss is actually one of the more controversial issues, in many ways. Actually, is Prop 25, which would be ending cash bail and changing the system of bail here in California. Would you like to speak a little bit more about what that's going to look like and what this proposition would affect?
Yeah, with Prop 25, it's one of those that you have to understand how voting yes or how voting no is going to make a difference, right? And what that means, because essentially, if it passes, so if it's, voters decide to, majority of voters decide to vote yes for it, it's going to uphold a 2018 law, right? That was passed signed into law by Governor Brown, which eliminates the cash bail system and replaces it with an algorithm, really, that assigns people depending on the risk for not appearing to trial, right? And so essentially that is a law right now, and voters are deciding whether we want to keep this, uphold the current law that has been in place since 2018, or not, right? Or go back to the cash bill system. And we know that, this is going to transform how people, essentially get out of jail while they're waiting trial. And this it does impact a lot of the communities that, we work with, we represent, in the Inland Empire, and in our region, and particularly communities of color, as we had mentioned, are disproportionately, in the criminal justice system. And so this is going to be a proposition that voters have to determine, right, whether they are going to uphold what has been the law for the past, 2 years, or go back to, a cash bail system.
Right, and a lot of folks were glad to see the kind of cash bail system go when it first did, but there have been some concerns actually about this algorithm, and specifically about the nature of predictive policing, which is an algorithm really free of bias? Can it generate equity, or do they replicate the biases of, for example, institutions that they work for? And so this issue has come under fire, and I believe the NAACP actually opposes this legislation, but a lot of communities are seeing that this system may actually benefit them as moving away from cash bail, which does have some, other issues that communities have highlighted before. And there are others who believe that a cash bail system is actually a more equitable system. So there are a lot of issues related to which way this legislation goes, and if, for example, voters were to maintain the algorithm and permanently get rid of the cash bail system, what effect this could have on communities of color is something that we can see later, especially with really the further rise of predictive policing.
Yeah, you touched on a couple of good points, and I think that's what makes this proposition in particular not only controversial, but it gives voters. It's not very clear, right? Because on the algorithm piece, right, it could be where it's not long term not working, and so this could be a proposition that perhaps it intends to many people do right by dealing away from the cash bill system, but also perhaps doesn't provide a solid alternative, right? And so this is a in my perspective, it could be a proposition as we've seen. We're many of these propositions that we're seeing today are amendments from propositions 10 or 20 years ago. So this could be one where, depending on how voters decide, that could be perhaps looked into in the next couple of years, because there might be something of a ramification to do that we need to do with it, right? Because both the technology is continuing to just change the way that we deal with pretty much anything and everything, but also understanding that it could have some flaws, right? And so that is something I think it is why it makes it such a tough proposition where it's not so black and white, and that also imposes really the need for us to continue to talk about and really look back at whether it's policies or propositions that have been passed, and how do we continue to adjust them to both what the public and the voters want, and also what technology has to offer, and what the change in interests are as well with voters.
Yeah, definitely, and it is a very controversial issue, and this is somewhat of a not just a partisan issue. It actually does cut along bipartisan lines, where the parties in different conservative and progressive parties and institutions have sided on very diverse ends of this issue. And I think there's a lot to be said about, California as leading the pace of innovation in the United States, and, whether, using the same innovation that we're using in the private sector, when we apply it to places like the justice system, how successful are they? Where do they end up? And yeah, I do think that, even if voters do make a decision this time around, that there will be larger consequences and bigger questions that are brought up by this issue, and it will probably be an issue that we'll be seeing for a while.
Yeah, and I think it also touches on the need to be evolving, right? I think with both policies and decision making, uh, the decisions that are made in our government, they do have to evolve, and we do have to, as also as citizens, adjust to those changes, just because we can't sort of always be relying on what excuse me, what used to work 20, 30 years ago. And also we have different needs now, both economically and socially. And so I think I agree with you in terms of looking back. Looking forward, I think we're going to look back and say, how can we adjust things, and so yeah.
Definitely, yeah. And thank you for that. And I think this wraps up our conversation about the different propositions, and especially the more hot button issues in the on the ballot this year. Of course, there are so many propositions, and we were only able to outline a few that are kind of standing out as larger issues within California, and that will shape voters' decisions and the state and our communities further on. I think especially Prop 22, Prop 17, Prop 25. They're going to have big issues on our community in the future.
Yeah, no, this has been really good. I think many times when voters get their voter guide right from the registrar's office, has a one or two sentences about the proposition, and a voter does really have to go out of their way, and they should, right, to look into what is it that what's the context behind the proposition, who's funding the proposition, who was it plays by, and how is it that it applies to them as individual voters, but also how it impacts their community at large, and the state. And I think being the great state of California that we are, also how it's going to impact the country. And so for a lot of our work, right, with voters, it's really giving those tools to understand what is make informed and really educated decisions on how we're going to be shaping the next 10-20 years of our democracy here.
Yes, definitely. And this is probably one of the most important elections in our lifetime for a variety of reasons. And it's definitely going to be a completely different type of election, which who knows, maybe around for the long term future. And then, there are a lot of important questions associated with that.
Yeah.
And like we touched on earlier, our organization is actually doing a lot of work with digital outreach and helping people get in touch with the correct information, especially when it comes to ballot information. Would you like to talk about where some folks can access resources?
Yeah, I mean, aside from our digital social media platforms, right, on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, I think also one of the things where, now in a digital age, aside from, I think for the traditional voters that perhaps used to get their information, like you mentioned, in mailers or in some sort of hard copy way. I think now everything has been transitioning right to digitally, and so looking at organizations perhaps that align with their values and their perspectives can be really helpful. Many organizations, for us, right, one of our partner organizations, Seha Action, has released a voter guide on the propositions. And so those are good resources for voters to adhere to and to take a look at as a guidance, at least, or as a reference or clarification. And then obviously there's also really good information out there in a very unbiased ways, like How Matters, that puts out really good information about propositions. And those are all ways that voters can get more informed on what the propositions mean, will do, and how they will decide to vote. And yeah, and stay tuned also in our upcoming virtual events as well. On Tuesdays, Adonis, my colleague, will be in our Instagram live. And so if folks haven't had the chance to tune in on Tuesdays, check us out on Instagram and tune in on Tuesdays. Ask Adonis questions. And we're happy to also contact us via social media. If there are any things that we can refer people out to, we're always more than happy to.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for that. And thank you for joining our episode of Clear the Air podcast, where we discuss matters that affect our community, especially here in the Inland Empire, political and cultural. And visit our Facebook, Instagram, and our Twitter for more information. Thank you all, and hope to see you next time.